What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry. Danny's here. How's it going, Danny? How are you?
Chilling, as per usual. How about yourself?
I feel pretty shitty, to be completely honest.
Well, that sucks. Why?
Yeah. I'm not going to give you some bullshit answer. I feel pretty shitty. I have a backache. I think I pulled my lat in the gym.
Oh,
I'm losing my voice. I have the sniffles. So if I sound like the mouth breather from Hey Arnold, who is always breathing over Helga Pataki, then it's just
good last name remembrance.
It's just my flu. That was my favorite cartoon. Hey Arnold is number one on the Nickelodeon roster for me. That's like bracket number in a 60-14 bracket. Hey Arnold goes number one. It's a definite one seed.
Who did you identify the most with?
I don't know. Probably Harold.
Harold? Yeah, that's a good choice.
Harold's like a big, gigantic doof, so I definitely can relate to that. I wasn't a bully like that, but I think I relate to Harold or maybe Stinky. one of those two. Not Sid, even though I liked Sid.
Yeah, I relate with Stoop Kid.
You were Stoop Kid?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, I was like, explain. What made you feel so isolated to the world?
You know, it's just
why didn't you leave the stoop?
You know, it's a fear of moving forward. I don't know.
Yeah, but my back hurts. Not to sound like a bitch right now, but I think I pulled something in the gym today or yesterday, actually. You know, I went through my entire lifting career never getting any type of injury ever. And over the past couple of months, I've been extremely busy and I've been missing valuable gym time. And I've been doing 0 rows. So 0 rows, just nothing for my back. And I jump on the cable row. I'm like, I need to start, getting back to the back. Start hitting the back again. And the next day I wake up, I feel like I have mono or something. Like my back is killing me. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah,
it's like my lat is so tight. I rolled out with one of those like extreme foam rollers, not just like the foam one that you get the piece of shit one that you find at the gym, like a $60 foam roller.
Yeah, I got one of those. Yeah,
and
super
I was
useful.
foam rolling earlier, right before this podcast, and you don't foam roll. You're not foam rolling correctly unless there's tears coming out of your eyes. Unless you're on the border of tearing up, you're not foam rolling correctly. Damn, I was tight,
bro.
Do you even foam roll, bro? Do you even foam roll? How's everything going? I don't want to bitch anymore.
No, I mean, I can bitch for a second. I have a bone to pick with radiators. So, it's getting cold here in the Northeast. It's getting cold everywhere. It's been fucking blizzarding everywhere. We missed that bullet. But, yeah, dude, I mean, fucking radiators suck, right? Most of New York City doesn't have, proper HVAC.
The thing about radiators is...
What's the deal with radiators? No, dude, it sucks. My radiator is it's got 2 settings. It's off, or it's the pits of hell. And that's it. And what sucks so much about it is that when we record, as many of you know, we're in New York City. I can't open a window, You'll hear everything, and we've got so much running through the streets. My window actually faces the street, and there's a bar across the street, so it's a wonder how we, get the quality that we do. But so I can't open a window. I never take my AC unit out because sometimes at 3 a.m. it's just so fucking hot. I just have to cut it on for 20 minutes just to cool the room off. Can't do that, So I'm sitting here, and our episodes run, about an hour and a half with maybe 20-30 minutes at the beginning and the end just for us to talk shop, and I'm in here for 2.5 hours. It's straight up sauna. But what sucks the most about it is that it's a dry heat, and every morning I wake up I'm super parched, I've been walking through the desert or some shit like that. Dude, I hate radiators. Not to mention the fucking clanging sounds that they make every now and again. You know that clanging sound? It's just like someone striking an iron. Super annoying. Fucking hate radiators.
How old is your building?
I don't know. Our unit is very well renovated. It looks brand new. The only thing that's not new about it is there's fucking radiators. It's crazy. Man, if I ever get a house of my own, HVAC all the way. I will never do radiators.
The thing about radiators is, well, I'm very sorry to hear that it's so physically demanding for you to record this podcast.
You know, the things I do for
I'm here
love.
I'm here with a broken back, and I'm recording.
And I'm just sweating.
And I'm just sweating. No, the same thing happens to me. It is terrible to record this podcast during the summer. I'm so glad that it's not summer anymore.
Yeah.
It's torture.
Yeah.
Because we have to close the windows,
Yep.
and it's
You
just
can't
awful.
turn the AC on for sure.
Yeah,
That makes
because the noise sips in. We left the AC on. One episode we did, I forget, I think it was you. Not to throw you under the bus, Danny, but you left the
That
AC
sounds
on.
like me, yeah.
And I think I was on editing duty, and I was listening to it. I was like, Danny! Danny! Like in Home Alone 2, when he's like, Kevin, you spent $1,500 on room service!
Kevin!
All right, let's stop boring the people who are listening. All right, let's get into the topic. So, what we wanted to talk about is, well, we haven't touched this, and it's been going on for the past 2 months or so. The Iraqi protest,
Yep.
and you know what made me? Well, I've been interested in it, but it's kind of confusing for a lot of people. I've realized these protests that are going in Iraq, because it's flipping a lot of the heads, or it's flipping a lot of the rules on its head,
Right.
as far as a lot of people are concerned, or at least people who are getting into foreign policy and Middle Eastern politics, at least now. Because I think they're confused. What you're seeing right now in Iraq is protest against a largely Shiite dominated government, but you know, you would expect it to be all Sunnis who are protesting, but from what it seems like, it's pretty universal across Iraq between the people who are protesting. It's both Sunnis and Shiites, and a lot of people get confused because most people see things in sectarian lens, and they're like, wait. I thought Sunnis and Shiites were uniformly, completely and unconditionally supportive to their religious leaders, right? Or to their party, or to their, you know, religious affiliates, or, you know, whatever. And you're seeing kind of a universal protest against the government in Iraq right now. Mm-hmm. And a big part of that protest is that a lot of people, well, first of all, Iraq is one of the most corrupt countries on planet Earth.
Yeah, move over Ukraine, right?
And they've been corrupt for a very long time. And ironically, the countries that are the two of the most corrupt countries on Earth are Iraq and Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. I wonder why. What happened?
I can only wonder.
How did those countries get so bad? I mean, not to say they weren't bad before. However, corruption is through the roof, at least by the standards that we go by here. Now, a big part of the protest, or a big theme of this protest, has been against Iran. So a lot of Iraqis are frustrated with what they see as a lot of foreign influence of not only the United States, but Iran as well. And this is another thing that's kind of making people confused, because wait. What do you mean foreign influence from? The United States and Iran? How does that work?
Yeah,
Don't they
right.
hate each other? Aren't we
Right.
about to go to war with Iran? You would be
6 months
right.
away from it, right?
So when these things happen, it's confusing if you look at everything within a sectarian lens, or, you know, if you look at the United States as a government that is pro-Sunni and anti-Shiite, or however you want to look at it, because that's definitely not the case, or at least it hasn't been the case for the entire U.S. history. But it's interesting. Now, something that caught my attention was, and this is pretty tragic, I'm not trying to make light of this, but something called the soda can challenge, the Iraqi soda can challenge. Did you see that on Twitter at all, or do you see that trending?
No, is that like when you try to like put a soda can in your mouth, or?
No, so it's a lot worse. So basically, protesters have been dying in mass. This hasn't been like the Hong Kong protests, where I think at this time we're recording this on, oh look, the protest is coming here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we were prepping for this thing for 10 minutes. No,
20 minutes.
20 minutes. So a lot of people have died during these protests, unlike the Hong Kong protests, where there's been a couple of deaths. I don't even think there's been a couple. I think last time I checked,
they have a death count, but it's not as high as
they
this
have a death
Iraqi.
count, but it's relatively low. The Iraqi death count right now, these protests are, last I looked at it, it's over 400 at the very least.
Right.
It's a lot of people within 2 months just protest. That's like, you know, Gaza type numbers.
Yeah.
And
it's like 50 people a week. That's crazy.
One of the images is that there was a tear gas canister that was fired into somebody's head, and the person died on impact. And that video went viral across Twitter, and a lot of people are sharing it, and a lot of people are protesting by saying, you know, hey, we're standing with the Iraqi people. You know, they're putting soda cans to their head and to camaraderie with the people who are protesting within Iraq. And it's sad. It's you know, the Iraqi government is I think it's basically being seen as a government that has betrayed, you know, the people of Iraq. And I think that with these types of things, and the prime minister recently, he was called to, with a lot of pressure from a lot of the religious community, and I'm sure Iran as well, has stepped down, has resigned. He put it in his papers. Minister Abdul Mahdi, who's a pretty famous name, he is resigning as prime minister of Iraq, which isn't really surprising. I think it was pretty much expected by most people when these protests really started to take place, because Iraq, I think about only 30% of that country of the adult population is employed right now.
30%.
36% right now is the number I'm looking at. Now,
that's like nobody.
That's like nobody. And I guess one of the benefits of when, let's just say if you're going to look at this in a sectarian lens, one of the benefits of your religious identity or religious power taking control of the government is that, you know, the government's supposed to hand out these jobs for you, and we have no jobs. So it kind of seems like a big wash. Well, I mean, there's only so many government jobs that you can have, and you can't. And Iraq is a relatively big country compared to the rest of the Middle East.
Right.
So it's not enough jobs for people, and there's there's irrigation problems, like there's in a lot of places within the Middle East. People don't have electricity there. It's bad, and it's worse than it was before Saddam. It's worse now than it was when Saddam Hussein was in power.
Well, I mean, we absolutely wrecked their infrastructure. So
because their infrastructure was destroyed,
right?
And a lot of the rebuilding, you know, a big part of the rebuilding effort was basically a big welfare project, and not welfare for the people there. It was welfare for the corporations and the contractors who were hired to clean the place up.
Right, and that's the corruption that you speak of.
And that's the insane amount of corruption that you speak of, because a lot of these Iraqi officials were just skimming money off the top. If you look at the oil for food program, which started before the Iraq War II, which started in the 90s. However, I mean, that was super corrupt, where politicians were just taking money from the top. The money didn't really get anywhere. The oil for food program was basically a program where Iraq would get sanction relief in the form of aid from oil that they produce, because Iraq is a major oil producer. They're a major OPEC producer, so they shouldn't be in this position because of the amount of natural resources that they have. But regardless, they're poor.
Do you know where their standing is in terms of oil production, or at least what their peak oil production can be against, say, someone like Saudi Arabia? It's
not close to Saudi Arabia, but they're, I want to say, the third largest oil or second largest oil producer in the Middle East. Don't quote me on that, but it's either Iraq or Iran.
It's just like they produce a lot of oil.
They produce a lot of oil relative to other countries in the Middle East. They are a top oil producer in OPEC. And I mean, one of the big reasons for Desert Storm was because the U.S. and Saudi Arabia didn't want Iraq to get control of the Kuwaiti oil fields, because with the Iraqi oil fields and the Kuwaiti oil fields combined, then they would be a dominant oil supplier. Mm-hmm. But I digress. So I want to talk about I want to go back and kind of look at this in a macro lens instead of a micro lens, because it's easy to get caught up in like the storm.
For sure.
And kind of follow like the individual events that are happening on the ground. And I don't necessarily think that is the best way to understand the overall picture of what's happened in Iraq over the past, really since the year 1914, since World War One. I think that's where you really have to start the story. If you want to go back further, maybe you can go back 1,000 years ago.
To the ancient Sumerians. Let me stop.
To the ancient... Well, we got to go back to the ancient Mesopotamia. Let me tell you about the most useful app on my phone. It's hard to find the time to sit down to read. When you don't have free time, you can't read or work on personal development. There's an incredible app that solves this problem, and I highly recommend it. It's called Blinkist. Blinkist is really unique, and it works on your phone, your tablet, and your web browser. Blinkist takes the best way, key takeaways, the need-to-know information from thousands of nonfiction books and condenses them down into just 15 minutes so you can read or listen to. Successful people, like business leaders, are well known for reading a lot of books. Blinkist is made for busy people like you who want to get the main points of a book quickly so you can start using that information right away. And with this audio feature, which I really love, Blinkist makes it easy to finish a book during your commute, on your lunch break, or while you exercise. 8 million people are using Blinkist right now, and it has a massive, growing library. From self-help, business, health, to the history books, Blinkist has the latest titles from bestsellers list, as well as the classic nonfiction titles you always meant to read, but never had time to. I regularly listen to Blinkist on my commute. It is awesome. Danny, I know you're getting way more into Blinkist now, too.
Hell yeah. I just wrapped up Physics of the Impossible because I'm a nerd. It's by Michio Kaku, and it talks all about, kind of the technology in these sci-fi novels and movies and TV shows, and, how far are we from, going into hyperdrive, and, can we do these teleportations and stuff like that. I think it's cool for anyone who's interested in, future tech like me, or, sci-fi nerds just like me, or anyone, interested in, physics and astrophysics like me.
There's a lot of really good, I'm being completely honest, there's a lot of really good books on Blinkist. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which I recommend for anyone who's starting a business or anything like that, is a really great kind of business foundation to learn. And Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb's on there, which is about highly improbable events and how people cope with them. There's an awesome collection there, so get on Blinkist. Get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books. All the books you want, and for one low price. Right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/bro to try it free for 7 days and save 25% off your new subscription. That's Blinkist, spelled BLINKIST, Blinkist.com/bro to start your free 7-day trial, and you'll also save 25% off, but only when you sign up at Blinkist.com/bro. All right.
Well, all right. So can you give a little bit of historical context? I think the 1914 sounds like a good place to start.
So I'll go back even further. So I think the first thing that you need to digest is that Iraq is a new thing. It's a relatively new country. It's about 100 years old, and it's the borders don't really make much sense. It's an artificial state.
Just like a lot of the countries that we talk about.
Just like a lot of the countries that we speak about. So the way Iraq on a map, you have the Sunnis who are in the center. You have the Shiites who are in the south, and then you have the Kurds who are in the north. And these borders, they were drawn during and first they were drawn at the beginning of World War I in 1915, before the war concluded, but they were really finalized at the end of World War I. And these borders, they're through Sykes-Picot between the British and the French. Sykes-Picot. And basically they were just drawing a line. They took a crayon and they were basically kind of bargaining and having a hissy fit over which territories that they would get from the Ottoman Empire. So they were doing things like they had different oil interests, and France had different interests within the Middle East as well regarding Syria and a lot of cultural things. And there's a lot of kind of bitter resentment between the two countries, even though they were partners in the war in World War I. But there was a lot of resentment of things that went past, imperial pursuits, imperial rivalries that were happening in Africa during the 1800s, and a lot of that. a big part of that had to do with how the lines were drawn. But the Brits' main interest was a lot of their oil interest within the Middle East, because they had recently found oil in Iran, and they were switching their navy from a steam, from steamships or from coal-powered ships to oil-powered ships. So oil was a big deal for them.
Right. And they're situated right there. Like they've got this little tiny sliver that hits the Persian Gulf. The majority of their country is actually like landlocked.
And that's another reason why the Brits wanted favorable borders in Iraq, is because it hit the Persian Gulf, and that is a maritime road to India, which was still one of their most important possessions. But these cultures were not these borders were not drawn with the different cultures and a different languages or cultures or religions or whatever you want to call it. They weren't drawn with the different communities in mind.
Right, like the Kurds were promised an area, and then they didn't get it, and they just lumped part of the Kurdish people into this giant Iraq that they created. We talked about that in our episode about the Kurds there.
Yeah, basically. So, yeah, they were just kind of drawn into Iraq. And the way the Ottomans had previously administered Iraq is they had it in 3 different areas. That's how they administered Iraq in 3 different areas. They had Mosul in the north for the Kurds. They had Baghdad in the center for the Sunnis. And they had Basra in the south for the Shiites.
Right.
And at the end of the war, when everyone carved up the Ottoman Empire like a Thanksgiving Day turkey. Happy Thanksgiving to everyone. We just had Thanksgiving. The British forged these provinces into one country, and they named it Iraq. And we don't even know where the name Iraq comes from. I don't know where the name Iraq comes from. There's only rumors where Iraq comes from.
No one really knows.
Some say it's Uruk, which is means riverbed, or Uruk. Uruk was an ancient Mesopotamian city-state.
Mm-hmm. Uruk.
So no one really knows where that name Iraq comes from. I think a Brit just was like, hey, mate, what do you want to call this piece of sand? I don't know, Minji. Why don't you call it Uruk?
Iraq sounds wonderful.
Rock. Oh, look at the rock on her. What did you say?
Sounds wonderful.
So they forged these provinces into Iraq. And I mean, to be fair, I'm definitely oversimplifying this, but of course you have differences not only in religion and ethnicity there, but you have different levels of urbanization in some area. There's tribesmen in the country, and there's more Western style peoples in the urban centers who are, have advanced degrees and have a higher level of literacy. And then you have people who are living in the country who have a lot lower rates of literacy and so on and so on. So there's a big difference there as well. And the way I like to think about this is that what do you think a map, what if you carved out Texas and Mexico and made them one state?
Well, at one point they were.
Yeah.
A long time ago.
And then one side succeeded from the other side. Yeah. What if you made Texas, and right now,
like
if you just redrew it, but in with the demographics that they have right now. So you had Texas, and then you put a government that was either let's just say pro-Mexican. Mm-hmm. Like that was very just a pro-Mexican nationalist, like an ethnic nationalist in power, and the capital was in Mexico City, and that they ruled with, complete authority over Texas and Mexico.
Be a fucking nightmare.
What do you think would happen? There'd be a lot of resentment from the people who were not Mexican.
Oh my God, Texans would totally take up their guns in a heartbeat.
Texans would absolutely take up their guns in a second. And they would fight for God. Like I'm telling you, they would fight for God. In the name of Jesus.
And the great state of Texas.
In the great state of Texas. So, because of this, you have a country that lacks really an identity, and they lack identity or any type of civic nationalism. And Iraqi leaders, they tried to unite the country through pan-Arabism. Throughout the entire 20th century, they were always trying to unite the country with Arab nationalism.
Hold up, though. What what is Pan-Arabism?
So Pan-Arabism is the belief that, it's kind of like, it's the belief that all Arabs should unite into one state ultimately. Like that's the main goal of Pan-Arabism, that there be one united Arab republic across North Africa and the Middle East, all Arabs speaking the same language, and together they would be a powerhouse. And there was Arab leaders in the 1950s and 60s who were trying to reach that goal. Right. You saw Egypt and Syria unite for a little bit, but that didn't work out because the Egyptians and the Syrian government didn't get along. When that merger happened, the Egyptians didn't really treat the Syrians that well, and they got fed up and they succeeded, and it just didn't work out. But there was this goal of Pan-Arabism where they recreated Arab nationalism and they tried to become secular and throw out all the religious stuff or sectarian stuff out the window and unite under being ethnic nationalists or civic nationalists rather than religious nationalists.
I see.
Which you can argue is probably or could be better, or at least for civil wars.
Yeah.
Now,
but that, as you point out, probably wouldn't work out because of, cultural and religious differences.
Well, the question you have to ask is like, all right, so if Iraq is a Shiite country, so how did the Sunnis have power prior to the Iraq War?
Right.
Because Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. Mm-hmm. The reason why they had power, and they had power for over 1,000 years, is because the Ottoman Empire, they counted on the Sunni city administrators to be a bulwark against the Persian Empire, as well as a lot of the tribesmen in Iraq as well in the country. Mm-hmm. The Shiites haven't been in power in Baghdad since the Fatimid Caliphate 1,000 years ago, when the caliphate was centered in Cairo.
Oh, they had a caliphate in Cairo?
Yeah. The caliphate, the center of the caliphate, it kind of changed. It changed headquarters a lot throughout the Arab Empire. Like it was in Mecca, then it was in Damascus, and then it moved around depending on who was in charge. But yeah, in Cairo, that was the only time there was a Shiite caliphate, or the last time there was a Shiite caliphate. Mm-hmm. So what you have is that this power structure was broken. This power structure of the Sunnis in running Baghdad was broken when the U.S. invaded Iraq.
Well, yeah, this is a good question. Why do you think the U.S. went to war in Iraq? Like, what were those motives?
So I think there's a lot of reasons. You can't just nail it on. You can't just come up with one reason. Like the war was for oil. The war was for Israel.
Oil.
The war was for
oil.
War for oil. It was the Israelis who did everything, or the war was. There's lots of reasons why countries go to war, and usually when enough reasons align, they make it possible for the country to go to war. And I think there was a lot of political motives as well internally. I think for George Bush, Cheney, the neoconservatives all had their own specific reasons why they wanted to go to war in Iraq. Like George W. Bush, he had legitimacy problems after the election in 2000.
Illiteracy problem?
Legitimacy problems. But he had both. He had illiteracy problems and he had legitimacy problems. But George Bush, you have to remember that he lost the popular vote. And then it was still a pretty controversial election.
Yeah.
Bush only won Florida by 0.009%.
That's a rounding error.
I know. And many speculate that Gore should have won.
He totally
We don't know
should've.
the true answer to this day.
Yeah, he totally should have. But
most people argue that Gore actually won the election and the election was completely botched. But it was the largest post-election controversy that we've ever experienced in our lifetime, right?
For sure.
Like I don't remember how long was that recount? A couple of weeks.
Yeah,
I was young when
that happened.
We were both young when that happened.
It drug on for a long fucking time, though.
But it dragged on for a while. But immediately after that, there was a legitimacy problem with George W. Bush. And what's the best way to solve a legitimacy problem? Go to war. Mm-hmm. I remember this. Right after Bush was elected, we got into some scuffle with China because we were flying some spy planes over China, and there was a pursuit on that plane, and a Chinese pilot ended up dying, and an American pilot ended up he crash landed. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do.
This is ancient history, but this happened. This kind of blew over because of everything that happened with 9/11 and all that. But a lot of people were nervous that
you're gonna go to war with
U.S.-Chinese tensions were going to get worse. Then that was like the big headline news when I was. Damn, I was fucking young when this happened.
Middle school, yeah.
I was not even in middle school yet.
Yeah.
So, so Bush had his reasons. Also, I think he wanted to finish a job that his daddy started. My daddy said he wanted to show him off, really. He's like, you couldn't get the job done, daddy.
I'm going to get that Saddam.
I own a baseball team and I got Saddam. Dick Cheney had his reasons as well. He had to pay off his Halliburton cronies. Like, people don't remember that Cheney was a pretty bad CEO. When he was the CEO of Halliburton, before he left Halliburton, he merged with a company called Dresser Industries that ended up costing the company millions in legal claims due to asbestos exposures. So he ended up kind of like fucking Halliburton. And I think that was a way for him to pay them back when he was in office, is go to war. Rumsfeld wanted to transform the military, the Rumsfeld Doctrine. And then, Rumsfeld could be thrown in with the neoconservatives as well. The neoconservatives wanted to implement their insane foreign policy papers that they were writing over the past couple of years. Like rebuilding America's defenses. Remember when we read that?
Mm-hmm. That was an interesting read.
About a Pax Americana.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about America as like the Roman Empire and how they need to create combat troops that can control like a...
That have no fear.
A squadron of 5 soldiers that have no fear, that are pumped up with drugs, and that could control like a 100-mile radius with just 5 soldiers.
All of Gettysburg with 5 guys.
Yeah, a field the size of Gettysburg with just a handful of soldiers who had the ability to call in drone strikes from their helmets. Basically, just...
it read like a Tom Clancy novel, let's be real.
It read like a new Call of Duty game. That's what it read like.
For sure.
Not even Tom Clancy. It read like some 13-year-old coming up with like some crazy ideas about a video game he wants to play. But those are the type of ideas that those neoconservatives had. They're also talking about creating weapons that would genetically kill people based off their DNA.
Right. That's some Nazi level shit.
They're talking about in the future. We will have weapons that will be able to target someone's DNA based off race or ethnicity. Just some
so nuts,
sick stuff. And then talking about the only way to achieve this is that there needs to be like a Pearl Harbor type catastrophe, which is very weird. The fact that 9/11 happened after that. So it was just a.
Let's not go down.
I encourage you. Yeah, let's not go there. But I encourage you to read Rebuilding America's Defenses. It's a long document, but you'll be able to read it pretty quickly. It's astonishing, a lot of the stuff that's in there about what the neoconservatives planned or what their like kind of dream idea for the future of America's defense. Mm-hmm. It's shocking, and it gets a lot of attention. So you'll be able to find a lot of stuff on it, or a lot of writers who put their 2 cents on about it. But I encourage everyone to read that document. If you want to read one PNAC paper, The Project of a New American Century, that's the one that you have to read. And then there was the other big policy paper that was a clean break, a strategy for securing the realm, which was written by David Wurmser and Richard Pearl, a.k.a. the Dark Lord. That's what he called himself.
He called himself the Dark Lord?
That's what him and his little neoconservative buddies, because the neoconservatives, what people need to realize about that's like
lame.
they're like a clique of like a couple of dozen people.
Yeah.
It's like a couple of like 80 guys who are considered neoconservatives, who are like the real neoconservatives. Those are the guys like Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, Billy Crystal, of course. Like all those guys are like the neoconservatives when you think of neoconservatives. People lump in a lot of people with neoconservatives, but that's like the true neoconservatives who are former Trotskyites who who were mentored by Senator Harry Jackson, who was like a blue dog kind of Cold Warrior Democrat, and they eventually became the neoconservatives that we know today. And the neoconservatives that we still, who are still writing policy papers and are still on MSNBC on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that too, because I know we've talked about how MSNBC is flipped, but I just saw, this one reporter, Crystal Ball. She used to be on MSNBC a lot. She's now over at The Hill, and she gave this really awesome kind of breakdown of how MSNBC changed, and now how they're like just basically a hub for neocons and neolibs. It's nuts. That's also an interesting topic, how that's changed. How MSNBC lost the left, but somehow a bunch of like basic lefties still watch that shit, and it's like completely different narrative.
Well, what happened with MSNBC is that they, with those neoconservatives that are constantly given talking gigs on it, they were so disgraced, or if you look, they're pretty disgraced within the Republican Party, or I wouldn't say completely disgraced, because there's still a lot of neoconservative elements within the Republican Party. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. However, I think that appearing on MSNBC type shows or type networks would maybe sanitize them from a lot of their past mistakes. And I think if they kind of overzealously went against Trump, they would get forgiveness from the American kind of mainstream left. So I think that was kind of the angle, because at the end of the day, neoconservatives, they care more about power rather than a political ideology. It's all about, their ideology is all about dominance to me. Like when you read their papers, it's all about just dominating other people. It's really sick. And then you see all the neoconservatives, when you look at them, not to go into people's looks or anything, but they're all just kind of like fat, ugly men. They're fat, weedy, ugly people. Men. Yeah. Richard Pearl, who is the fattest and ugliest of the neoconservatives, arguably, he wrote a paper called A Clean Break. And he wrote this paper not for an American. He wrote it for an Israeli prime minister named Benjamin Netanyahu while he was serving his first term as prime minister of Israel in 96. And basically, the narrative was, they wrote a paper, it's called A Clean Break, and they write about how they need to pretty much change the borders of Sykes-Picot, and they need to chop up, and they need to kind of break these places into different states and all whatnot. And basically, the plan was that they would get rid of Saddam Hussein and then eventually Iran. And the way they would do that is that when they got rid of Saddam Hussein, the Shiite majority in the country, they would have a liberal democracy. They would have something like that. They'd all be happy because the tyrant was gone. And then the people of Iran, they would see that because they're right next to each other, Iran and Iraq. They would see that, and the people of Iran would be influenced by Iraq's new loving government, and then they would boot out all the Ayatollahs. So you all kick them out, and it'd be one happy family, secure Middle East.
Sounds like
that was the narrative. And then they would get a Hashemite king to replace Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Just remove Saddam and put a Hashemite king in there. The Hashemites were the royal family in Saudi Arabia before the Saud just took power. And it was a common practice to throw around Hashemite kings in these new states. Like, hey, just put a fucking Hashemite king in there. Oh, we got a new state. We got a new Middle Eastern state. Who's going to rule it?
Hashemite king.
Just put a fucking Hashemite. I can imagine them saying it like this, like, all right, so once we get rid of Saddam Hussein, what are we going to do next? Like, we're going to purge the government. Like, what are we going to do? Just put a fucking Hashemite king in there. They'll be happy.
They'll figure it out.
They love being dominated. A Hashemite king will just come in there. Prince Abdullah, do you have any cousins? We want to get some cousins on.
We got a gig for one of your cousins.
We got a gig. We got a gig for a king in a new version of Iraq. We're perfect. King Abdullah is the king of Jordan. He is the Hashemite in power.
I know.
But that was the plan. I think looking at that is the most innocent way that you could look at it. Now, I don't know if people are going to have different narratives on it if it's for profit. I mean, I think that the majority of the Iraq war was to fund a big welfare project for select industries. However, that's besides the point, because I want to get into the consequences. So
because the opposite happens, right?
So what happened? So the game plan was to topple all these countries. There's another paper. There was another seven countries. Why is the name escaping me right now of the person, the U.S. general who came out and said that the plan to topple 7 governments was in place. 7 countries where they were going to topple all these Middle Eastern countries. Now, the plan with Iraq was once that they really thought that toppling Iraq was going to be a bulwark against Iran, because Iran would see all that, all that fun American kind of capitalism going on, or whatever they really thought. Because the neoconservatives, Paul Wolfowitz, he described himself as a libertarian, which was weird enough, because I don't think anyone would ever look at him as a libertarian. And what actually happened after the U.S. invaded Iraq is that Iran was empowered. Who would have thought? Iran was the country that ended up getting ultimate influence in Iraq. Iran's allies ended up getting into power. That's why the Dawa Party in the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, Skiri, ended up getting into power. That was the new government. So not a they were pro-American because they had to be, because they were put in power ultimately by Americans. It took the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps to sack Baghdad to put the Shiites in power. But the ironic thing is that they were putting people who were friendly to Iran in power, which seems kind of ridiculous.
Right. And
this new government that was put in power, they were Iraqi exiles who fled Iran in the 1980s during the Iran-Iraq War.
So they were Iranian?
They were Iraqi, but they were Iraqi Shiites. They were Iraqi Shiites who fled. And I'll get into that. So Jimmy Carter gave Saddam Hussein the green light to invade Iran, and Ronald Reagan funded him in order to hold back the Iranian Revolution. That's important context to realize, because we supported Saddam Hussein at one time to be a bulwark against Iran, because the United States was very upset about the Iranian Revolution.
Right.
They were very upset about losing their best friend in the Middle East, because the United States and Iran used to be very tight. They used to call Iran Little America.
That's interesting.
Believe it or not. They were the only country to get the F-15. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
That's the only country that the United States sold the F-15 to. Iran. Can you believe that? Or no, it was the F-14, excuse me.
Yeah, and they still have them too.
They still have it. The only country they sold the F-14 to. Not even Israel got the F-14. That's how close the United States was with Iran and the Shah and the government there. So they were very upset when that government when the Shah died in the U.S. of cancer, and that government collapsed upon itself, and this new mean old scary Ayatollah comes to power and starts talking about Islamic revolutions. As you'd imagine, that can piss everyone off. So these people who fled Iran or fled Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War were the ones who were put into power after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Mm-hmm. And then Ayatollah Sistani of Iraq, who was a main Shiite religious leader in Iraq, he came out and he said, come out and vote. Come out and vote. All you Shiites, the majority, come out and vote.
He got the vote out.
Come out and vote, like MTV vote. So the Shiites did. And the Shiites put a Shiite chauvinist power in. They put a Shiite chauvinist government in power. So that's what happened. So the U.S. ended up, the soldiers who fought in Iraq, they were fighting on the side of Iran. They were fighting for Iran. They were fighting for the Supreme Islamic Council. They were fighting for Skiri. They were fighting for Ayatollah Sistani. That's who they were fighting for there. Not for Americans. They were fighting for the interest of the Iranians. And it's so funny because now
to them.
the U.S. foreign policy, I mean, it's always been very anti-Iran. However, it's kind of hilarious. Like, I think that after Ayatollah Sistani came out and called it as one man, one vote, where he starts calling for all Christians, all believers in Allah, the one true God, to come out and vote for the Shiites, or to come out and vote. You have the Curb Your Enthusiasm music must go off.
Yeah.
Like, dun, 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 dun. Like, is that the point where the Curb Your Enthusiasm music goes off?
Yeah.
God, and it's ridiculous. It doesn't make sense. When you like break it down and you look at it at a macro level, it just looks completely silly.
Right.
And the U.S. was funding Shiite militias to go after Sunni insurgencies as well. And by tilting the balance of power into the hands of the Shiites, that meant tilting it away from our allies in Saudi Arabia. And after this happened, King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, he took Dick Cheney to the woodshed. Cheney had to go to Saudi Arabia and apologize to King Fahd. And King Fahd was like, what the fuck did you do? You were supposed to put the next Joseph Stalin lookalike in power. Like, you were supposed to put the next guy with a mustache, the next Sunni general in power after that.
Right.
Not the Iranians.
Right.
Like, and Dick Cheney had to apologize. He's like, yeah, I know, we messed up.
Oops.
Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. We You know how Dick Cheney's like, well, we miscalculated this. Well, even though Dick Cheney actually predicted all of that in the early 90s when he was asked about not going to war, not going to Baghdad, he was like, well, what's going to happen is that, the Kurds are going to break off and then there's going to be, ethnic violence. We would have been all alone. So, I mean, Dick Cheney knew what he was doing.
He did
Which
it
leads
anyway.
me to suspect that Dick Cheney's not an idiot.
No.
Like, Dick Cheney's definitely one of the smarter ones out of that group. And I don't necessarily think the neoconservatives are smart. I think they're just criminals. And they're just like an organized crime unit.
No,
but Dick Cheney is one
smart.
of the...
They're just like smart for the wrong reasons,
You could be a criminal and
intelligent,
be unethical and get ahead in life. And, I don't think they're necessarily super clever. They just were ruthless and immoral in their actions. Dick Cheney, though, is definitely one of the smarter ones. Out of that clique, I would expect that he probably has the most intellectual horsepower, or probably had the foresight to understand. And I'm sure some of those neoconservatives really believed in that mission, that by toppling Iraq, that it was somehow going to make some chain of event happen where freedom was going to spread across the entire Middle East and spread like wildfire. I think some of them probably really believed that. I think some of them really, really had invested interest in some of these private equity firms that were investing in companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon.
Yeah.
So it was probably a mix and match of both profiteers and people who maybe they were convinced of it, or this popular consensus, like all their friends are rooting for the war, so why not root for it as well? Oh, we're going to profit as well. Well, they say it's going to it's going to create peace across the entire Middle East in the long run. So we might as well go along with it. So I think there is a combination of that. And you see people who formerly identified as neoconservatives, like Pratik, who we had on the show the other day, or a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
And he said he identified as a neoconservative, and he really believed in the mission to spread democracy. And I'm sure there are people who believe that those intentions were good. But in those groups with the people with good intentions, there was a whole lot of people with bad intentions who I think had the foresight and the understanding of what would happen when they
enacted those policies. Right?
When they put the wires together to cause a bomb to go off in the Middle East. Now, what's really interesting about these policy decisions and about what happened due to us tilting the power axis in Iran's favor is that the U.S. tried to redirect their foreign policy in the Middle East by backing the Sunnis after this. So let's just play identity politics in the Middle East. That's the best way to get peace. Like, let's just back this group. Let's just back this group. And meanwhile, in Baghdad, when Saddam, and I am not a Saddam apologist. I'm definitely not a Saddam Hussein apologist. Saddam Hussein is a very cruel, gross man who, by all intents and purposes, was a hitman and a brutal criminal. He wasn't even a general or a military officer. He was just a crime. He was just a assassin. Like, he was just a hitman. He was a guy who just went out and he killed people, dissenters to the government, and he tortured them. Like, he was just a torturer who was very scary and ruthless. He was a very evil person. Like, there's no doubt about this. Saddam Hussein was incredibly evil. He looked up to Joseph Stalin.
Right.
So by no means am I a Saddam Hussein apologist, but I will say that prior to him being hung on national television, I remember watching that when I was like 11 years old. Oh, look, the bad guy.
You got him.
It's like in Braveheart. Remember at the end of the Braveheart when they torture him to death?
Yeah.
I remember watching that when they pulled him out with that beard. I wonder what, it's funny because Roy Casagrande, who we did a couple times in his show, he says, I think until the very end, until he was hung, he didn't think that the Americans would actually do that to him. He said that. He's like, I kind of think it was. I think Saddam Hussein was just kind of like an isolated thug who didn't know anything else but like Middle Eastern power, Machiavellian politics. And he thought the Americans really did have his back from that time in the early. I think he kind of felt like he was playing along with a lot of these things that were going on, but he totally got fucked.
He missed the boat on that one.
I think he was just kind of has some major blind spots. Let's just put it that way when it came to his decision making and what he thought the U.S. was capable of and what he thought they weren't capable of. I think he ended up being wrong about that. So
we switch, right? We
switch.
Right.
So we start backing the Saudi allies, meaning the Sunnis, and what that means is that who are the Saudi allies? Like what's the Saudi military? The Saudi military is the head chopping Wahhabi lunatics that go around chopping people's heads off.
Right.
And the Sunni insurgency in Iraq becomes the worst part of the war. The majority of American casualties in Iraq were against the Sunni insurgency,
right,
led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Al-Qaeda of Iraq. That was the main killer of American soldiers was Al-Qaeda, was the Sunni-based insurgency. The Saudis don't have a military. We saw what happened when they go up against. The Saudis went through a total annihilation warfare where they were annihilated by like 200 guys dressed up like Jesus.
Right. That was just this year too.
They had
right?
battalions captured.
Yeah.
They're not an intimidating force. What they do is that they have the ability to throw money around and foster sectarian and kind of religious extremism across Muslim communities. And that's what they do. They fund madrasas in different parts of Europe as well as the Middle East, and they preach a very extreme version of Islam. That not all Sunnis are extremists like that. It's a small percentage of them. And just note that Wahhabism is a new phenomenon as far as world history is concerned. Wahhabism didn't really start until the 18th century. So it wasn't like, something that was deeply rooted within Islam. It was like the Amish, the Amish weren't around in the beginning of or the Puritans, they weren't around in the beginning of Christianity.
Definitely.
They're a movement that sprung out as a backlash against things like westernization and decadence from the Ottoman Empire and other European countries. So it's a new phenomenon, that extreme form of Islam that people look at and they condemn, and they try to kind of lump in every single Muslim in together as just like, they're crazy. They throw gays off buildings. Oh, it's kind of just like the go-to from the from a conservative when they talk about the Middle East. Like, they throw gays off buildings. Oh, so that's when the shift starts to support Sunni insurgencies, and that's when Barack Obama comes into office and he starts backing moderate rebels in Libya and moderate rebels in Syria. That was a continuation of the policy that was created during the Bush years. And that was a continuation of the policy of backing Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen by Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. So there's a deep history of funding violent mercenary groups, and we kind of just do it as different pendulum waves go back and forth. So that's kind of where we are right now. The U.S. fought for Iran in the Iraq War too. They fought on the side of Iran, and they put Iran ultimately in power in Iraq. So I think it's just kind of hilarious. It's like not hilarious.
It's just ironic.
It's ironic, and you can't help but look at the dark humor in the entire topic. Like, when does the Curb Your Enthusiasm music like come off at any point? Where the entire time, part of our axis of evil, Iran's in there, and we ended up fighting on behalf of their interest within the country. Like, our bitter rival right now, if you poll the average American, Iran's going to be up there as the top threat to America, along maybe with China. China is up there now with a lot of people. But yeah, that's where we're at. Kind of, those are the policy decisions that really kind of led up to what you're seeing right now in Baghdad, because you have a Shiite chauvinist government that they're basically leftover exiles that the Bush administration put in power. And since they haven't really done anything, since they're corrupt, because they were profiteering off this war as well. We're talking about Chalabi, who was convincing neoconservatives and who was a neoconservative favorite to take power in Iran, to become a leader, in Iraq. Basically, these guys were probably a lot of these guys are double agents of Iran to begin with. And you have to think, like, where they... Now, let's segue into this, because I think we can bring up... all right, so let's segue. But before we get started, this episode is sponsored by Blue Chew. Guys, remember the day when you were always ready to go? Now you can increase your performance and get that extra confidence in bed. Listen up, BlueChew.com. That's blue like the color blue. Blue Chew brings you the first chewable with the same FDA-approved active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis. You can take them anytime, day or night, even on a full stomach, and since they're chewable, they work up to twice as fast as a pill, so you can be ready whenever that opportunity arises, because I know it happens all the time for all of you guys. Just walking studs. If you can benefit from more confidence where it counts, Blue Chew is the fast and easy way to enhance your performance. Blue Chew is prescribed online by licensed physicians, so you don't have to go to the doctor's office or wait in line at a pharmacy. And it ships right to your door in a discreet package. So good news, it doesn't say boner pills in that package. They're made in the USA, and since Blue Chew prepares and ships direct, they're cheaper than a pharmacy. And best of all, there's no more awkwardness. Right now, we got a special deal for our listeners. Visit BlueChew.com and get your first shipment free when you use our special promo code BRO. Just pay $5 shipping. Again, that's BLUE Chew.com, promo code BRO to try it free. Blue Chew is the better, cheaper, faster choice, and we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you, Blue Chew.
Thanks, Blue Chew.
Blue Chew. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. Blue Chew. I wish I could end that. Blue Chew. Like Sega.
Sega.
I gotta talk to the guys at Blue Chew. Like, hey, let me be your ad guy. Yeah. Let me be your face. Let me be the face of Blue Chew.
Be the voice of Blue Chew.
The voice of Blue Chew. Blue Chew.
All right, so we were talking about corruption.
So let's segue into that Intercept article, because this is like the new rage of what everyone's talking about. So, all right. There was a document that was leaked by an Iranian, I believe it was an Iraqi official. It leaked to the Intercept, and the Intercept published it
in partnership with the New York Times.
It was published by the New York Times. It was syndicated across a lot of different publications, but the Intercept was the one that broke the story. And basically, the story is that it's called A Spy Complex Revealed. Leaked Iranian intelligence reports expose Tehran's vast web of influence in Iraq.
Epic.
Epic. of course, no shit, they had influence in Iraq. And I don't want to go over this. This is a pretty long article, so it's going to take you about a half hour to read the entire thing.
It took me a minute.
So I suggest reading it, but I'm just going to summarize it to the best of my ability. So what they go over and what they dive into is that Iran had a vast spy network within Iraq. And they basically had double agents, so people who are working for the Americans and people who are working for the Iranians. Now, what they kind of pointed out as one of the possible main reasons why so many why there was so much Iraqi intelligence embedded with Iran was because after the U.S. pulled out, they feared for their lives, and they felt that there was no other way to go except go for shelter or go for patronage with the Iranians for money and protection. Mm-hmm. So they felt they had no choice. But it goes deep into, it's about 600 pages that were leaked over to them, and they go over some highlights. So 700 pages of the document were leaked. You went through this document. What were your main takeaways?
I mean, I found it really interesting, after all this context that you've given just now, on the history and how we've been, basically playing both sides and kind of working for, in the interests of Iran. I found it super interesting that, they were so deeply embedded in, the Iraqi government, and it makes total sense. This is a country that they've been to war with. They see that it's like, they see a moment to capitalize, right? And for lack of, all of the, sanctions and things that they have placed on them, this is the one way that they were able to, exercise a whole lot of influence to get, to further their interests. I don't know. I thought it was really interesting how deeply ingrained into the Iraqi government they got.
Well, that's Iran's main defense. That's the only weapon they really have against the United States is to fuck around with their different proxy forces and their different allies across the Middle East, mm-hmm. because they have different allies in Lebanon, they have allies in Yemen, they have allies in Saudi Arabia, they have allies in Iraq, obviously, they have allies in Syria, and they're able to gain influence as basically kind of like a bulwark against the United States, or a protectorate, or at least another option of influence for people, I guess, who don't want to completely sell out, that they go over to Iran. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of an easy target, especially when it's a Shiite controlled government. When it's a Shiite majority government, you can imagine how easy it would be. It's just funny that it's like people think this is surprising that Iran has a humongous influence within a Shiite dominated government where they have all fancy ayatollahs and everything. And these people were former Iranian exiles. It seems to me, and what I think is that when the neoconservatives were kind of vetting these people, these Iranian exiles just told them whatever they wanted to hear. Yeah. They're like, yeah, sure, yeah, we'll just throw the king of Jordan. We'll throw a Hashemite king in there. They'll fucking love it. They'll love being dominated by a Hashemite king. We want money too. We want to make some money off this war. We want to go back home. I mean, they want to go back home too, and they want to get power within the government. So of course they said whatever they wanted to. They could have been working for Iran the entire time. They could have just saw the advantages right afterwards. I kind of think that they were definitely knew what was going to happen. That they ultimately intended to make friends with the Iranian government once they got into a position of power.
It's also super interesting how they, part of their interests were making sure Iraq doesn't fall apart. So in a way, at least the stated intentions of the occupation in Iraq from the U.S. was to make sure that they can set up a government, that they don't, completely fall into shambles. And, from a lot of these leaks, what the Intercept points out is that, their main goals were to make sure that Iraq doesn't fall apart, and that they don't start like a sectarian war, and that they don't, splinter into just nonsense. So it's also kind of funny that while while they're using double agents to gain influence and control, and do their basic shtick, they're also kind of doing a good thing, like the same thing that the U.S. would want. So like it's like they were operating on the United States interests as well, kind of in the same vein.
It's kind of funny because when you think about it, the Iranians and the Americans and the U.S. government, ultimately, they kind of have the same foreign policy goals in Iraq, where they don't want the government to completely collapse as of right now.
Yeah, it's
and
super interesting.
they both have the same goals, and they both don't want a resurgence of ISIS there, because what happened was that
Sunni militants in general. Yeah,
basically what happened is that you can look at this. You can look at Iraq and Syria in this perspective, that the Syrian war, the war in Iraq spilled into Syria, and then it spilled back into Iraq. Like it was a war that they keep on spilling on top of each other.
right.
It's just a perpetual cycle that keeps on going and going, because the Syrian war happened after the U.S. left Iraq, and people will a lot of people blame Obama. It's like, oh, after you pulled out in 2011, after that last troop left in December of 2011, that's what led to the emergence of ISIS. What ultimately led to the emergence of ISIS was a lot of different factors, not because the U.S. left. It was because ultimately the U.S. was there in the first place that something like that ultimately happened. But you can't blame Obama for that. It's definitely not Obama's fault. Yeah, if they were still there, would they have been able to protect Mosul from being sacked by ISIS and prevent the caliphate that take over? Yeah, definitely.
A big part
they definitely would have been able to stop that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, a big part of it was because we also dismantled their military, and we kicked out a lot of the previous people who had experience, and then just replaced them with a bunch of people who don't know what the fuck they're doing.
Well, that was a lot of the leadership in Al Qaeda of Iraq, and what people need to realize is that Al Qaeda of Iraq is ISIS. Like, they're the same group. ISIS is Al Qaeda of Iraq with a rebranded name. They basically went into a foreign market and started calling themselves something else. It's like if I open up a business in Canada and I just named it something else, but it was still operated with the same management teams and the same executives,
right,
and I just called it a different name in a different state or a different country, that's exactly what it is. They just reopened it. They rebranded Al Qaeda in Iraq as ISIS. And there was also some turmoil because ISIS was so ruthless and so brutal that they actually came to odds with the ISIS branch in Syria, al-Nusra, because they were so violent and so crazy. We're talking about, I mean, Al Qaeda is a violent enough group as it is.
Didn't they get kicked out?
They basically were like, Al Qaeda was like, you can't go over and kill even Sunnis. Like,
yeah,
you can't just kill everyone in the village and rape people repeatedly, because they were doing Mongolian style sacks in towns in Syria and Iraq and Mosul. They were doing they were lopping off 50 heads, putting them on spikes, like they were White Walkers from Game of Thrones.
Definitely.
Like the brutality of ISIS was something almost inconceivable in our modern times. And when they poured back into Iraq, that was definitely I think that was an unintended consequence, but the United States had to ally with the Shiite militias who are backed by Iran, who are funded by Iran, who have allegiance to Iran. They had to back with these groups who they were backing before anyway during the Iraq War to take on the Sunni insurgency. The Bada brigade who used to use hand drills on people's temples. It's funny because in the movie American Sniper, you ever see that movie?
Yeah.
They have the bad guys using power drills on people's temples. But they make it seem like the bad guys are doing it, like the Al Qaeda folks are doing it. That was our allies who were doing that. Right. That was a Shiite thing. The Shiites use power drills. The Sunnis chop off heads.
That's how it works.
That's how it works. It's funny because ultimately we're allies with Iran and Iraq, and then we're enemies with Iran and Syria.
It's so weird.
So you cross the border and you're an enemy, and then it's just
like
funny.
it's all unintentional. You know, it's like we're not intentionally trying to be allies with Iran in Iraq. It just so happens that we have the same goals in mind, maybe with different brands and different styles, but like, you know.
I know, and that's what it brings you to the point where geopolitical strategies align with countries' interest. Like, rarely do countries do things for some altruistic reason. Mm-hmm. They do it for some type of geopolitical interest, whether that be a interest from like a nationalist who wants to do something for the good of the country, or if it's from people who are trying to profit from it or interest in their own personal way. But it's always done by interest, never by altruistic reasons like, oh, we need to save these people. Like, yeah, there's so many people that the U.S. Army could save. You know how violent there's areas of the world are? You can cause a war for anything.
Right.
I mean, Trump has designated the Mexican cartel, or he wants to designate the Mexican cartel
as terrorist,
yeah. Which is a problem in itself, because now you're going to have to
do something about it.
You're going to have to do it. You're expanding the war on terror you're expanding the war on terror in the Western Hemisphere right on our border.
Right.
That's what I look at it. It's like, oh, no, now we're fighting the war on terror
against Mexico.
Pretty close to our own country. That's scary.
As
when does that happen?
as you can get, basically.
I feel like that ultimately would be that's a pretty counterproductive move. And the Mexican government doesn't want that, because that gives the United States autonomy,
basically impunity,
unconditional permission to go in there with their drones and blow up cartel.
Right. And you know what's going to go down. It's going to be cartel and a bunch of civilians.
They're going to start making kill lists. Like, hey, yeah, of course, cartel and a bunch of civilians, and then 5 civilians will get killed, and then
5.
I mean, it'll probably be a bigger outrage here because there's a much bigger Latin American population in the United States than an Arab population, so it probably would get a lot more pushback. And you know that the Democrats, as pandering as they are, they will definitely say something.
Maybe he's trying to do it just so we can get that wall built, you know? It's like, oh, there's terrorists on the other side. We definitely got to build that wall now.
Yeah, it's probably, well, terrorists there.
Do you want terrorists to come over? Look, they're terrorists.
So here are some interesting things I found in this. So here's a leak. So in November of 2014, one of them, an Iraqi who had spied for the CIA, broke and terrified that his ties to the Americans would cost him his life, switched sides. The CIA, according to the cable, had known the man by a nickname, Donnie Brasco. His Iranian handler would call him simply Source 134992.
Yeah.
So that's from the Intercept. So the above, I'm just looking at the actual document. The above mentioned pseudonym was Donnie Brasco, and he received a monthly salary of $3,000. That's a lot of money
especially over there, yeah.
After their contract of a year and a half ended, in addition to a meeting being held for him and a plaque of appreciation being presented for him, he was awarded $20,000 on a car.
That's
that sounds pretty open.
Yeah.
It doesn't even sound like secret exchanges, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't sound all
he got a plaque.
Secret. He got a plaque, clear evidence of his relationship with Iranian intelligence, and a car, and $20,000. Like, that sounds all right. If you're in nefarious activity with the American intelligence agencies, if you work for the CIA in some capacity, your ass isn't getting the fucking plaque.
Definitely not. No.
If anything, you'll be killed, like Jeffrey Epstein.
Let's not do that.
Your ass is not getting a fucking plaque.
No, definitely not.
I pulled out some other stuff in here. I got to pull up the actual article. Yeah, the above mentioned there. We have returned our previous share among the Shiites. The ministers of I can't spell. Municipal. You read it.
Wait, where is it? Hold on. We have retained our previous share among the Shias. The ministers of municipalities, communication, and human rights are Badrists and are in complete harmony and at one with us. 2. The Minister of Transportation, Mr. Bayan Jabber, is very close to the IRI. The Minister of Oil, Adil, has a special relationship with the IRI. The Foreign Minister, Jafari, has a special relationship with the IRI. The Minister of Health, Adila Mahmoud, is a member of the Dawa Party, Tanzim, but is, in her heart, loyal to the IRI. The Minister of Labor, Sudani, is closer to the IRI than the previous one, who is also a Sadrist. The Minister of Youth, Abdel Hussein Aptan, is better than the previous one, who is a member of the Supreme Islamic Council. The Minister of the Higher Education, Shahristani, is better than the previous one, Adib. It's like a fucking... It's like, you know, when you had on MySpace... Remember MySpace? You can like put your top 8 friends.
Yeah.
Here's a list of like Iran's like top 8 friends from Iraq.
Jesus Christ! It's just so ridiculous. You know that all these neoconservative types who push for these policies are shameless. So, you know, unintended consequences. Oh, they got to them first. It's just so funny. It's not funny, but it's funny. There's some degree of humor you need to take from it to have just. It was published in the New York Times, so you know it's getting some people are reading this. You know what I mean? I don't know if people are putting all the connections together of like how this policy began. Whether if they think that this is some kind of new phenomenon that happened, like, oh, Iran subverted our intentions in Iraq. I don't know if that is the light that's going off, or this is like the unintended consequence. But this is actually a pretty good article. I would recommend reading it because it does kind of give some good context of the Iraq War and what actually happened.
I got one more snippet that I thought was really fun.
Yeah,
okay, so this is like in relation to how Iran's been basically overtly and covertly helping Iraq, with their turmoil. So this one reads, Qasem Soleimani came to me and requested that we permit Iranian planes to use Iraqi airspace to enter Syria. I put my hands on my eyes and said, on my eyes, as you wish. Then he got up and approached me and kissed my forehead. This shit reads like a romance novel. It's hilarious. Oh, man.
And then I blew him. As a result of these operations... And then
he took his blue chew, and I felt his throbbing.
A long, hard road. As a result of these operations, the road from... We got to stop being so... it's funny because I do get feedback, and people either like the crude humor or they dislike it.
Well, if you read our like reviews on iTunes, it's hilarious. Like one of them is like fucking worst show ever. The next one, fucking best show ever. You know, we get really mixed reactions.
I find it funny when people are like fucking liberals, and then the next person will be like fucking conservatives.
Yeah, they're hilarious.
I'm just like, okay,
make up your minds.
This policy of Iran and Iraq has allowed the Americans to return to Iraq with greater legitimacy. And groups and individuals who had been fighting against the Americans among the Sunnis are now wishing that not only America, but even Israel would enter Iraq and save Iraq from Iran's clutches. This policy of Iran and its blatant interference in Iraq and Mr. Soleimani's measures and advertising maneuvers he launched caused Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE to unite against Iran. This has also further inflamed sectarianism between Shiites and Sunnis. These actions against the Sunnis will cause another group to rise up in the name of defending the Sunnis. We must think about limiting violence against innocent Sunnis in Iraq and limiting Mr. Soleimani's measures, or else violence and strife between Shiites and Sunnis will continue. Currently, any actions taken against Sunnis will be blamed on Iran, and whether Iran had a direct or indirect role in it or none at all. That's kind of what's going on right now.
That's a really good summation.
Because that's from somebody that's from someone in Iraq. Like that's an Iraqi intelligence person. That's true. Like that's kind of the position that these states are in, because there's no plausible deniability for Iran with Shiite militias or kind of a lot of the brutality that goes on. Because there is a lot of brutality that goes on in Iraq against Sunnis, especially now because you have all these leftovers who could be accused as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. So these people can just be kind of just dragged into the middle of the night and killed. You know, there were some people, some protesters, and there was a couple of kind of horrific stories. There was many. I mean, there's over 400 people have died, but there's been several horrific stories as far as shooting people, protesters indiscriminately, as well as just like Shiite militias going into houses and just killing like protesters they saw on TV.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I saw this couple on there protesting. Let's just go kill them.
Fucked up situation, man.
It is a fucked up situation. All right. We should post this article. I don't know. Do you have anything else to say on this?
It's nuts. I don't know. You should just read it. It's a long one, man. I feel like it's a minimum of a 15-minute read. Like, if you know what they're talking about, but it's totally worth reading because it's such a clusterfuck, and it's interesting to see all of these, these leaked cables come to light and basically, confirm a whole lot of suspicions, but also shed light on a whole bunch of interesting new things that we didn't even know what was going on.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much influence they had in Iraq, really. But it's not really surprising. No. So I've been kind of like thinking about just this period and I'm trying to create like this period in time from 2011 to now and probably going forward. And I've been thinking long and hard about it. Like, what do you think historians are going to call this era in the future? These wars in the Middle East. Because I have kind of like, when I say historians, I mean historians from 100 years from now. Are they going to call this, everything that's gone on in the Middle East between now, including Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, are they going to call it something like the 30 Years' War?
I think so. I was going to say the Long War, instead of the Great War, the Long War. Because this is like a 30 Years' War. I mean, it's going on at least 18 for our count, But if you peel it back and you look at like a lot of the conflicts that led up to, U.S. involvement, it's certainly been going on for decades.
Well, what makes it so similar to the 30-Year War is that there's a lot of very, very there's a lot of themes that are related with each other, but they're just in a different flavor.
Right.
So one of the major themes is that the 30-Year War was a war it was
a religious war.
It was a religious war on between one end,
sects.
But when you look into it, it was more of a power struggle between these monarchs and different governments in place.
It was economic. It was geopolitical. It was monarchic. It was all of those things.
But the main theme of the war was that it was a war between Catholics and Protestants.
Right.
And
sound familiar? Sunnis and Shias,
But you have, in the 30-Year War, you have countries switching sides on a regular basis.
That's right.
So you have the French who are fighting on behalf of the Catholics, and then they end up becoming allies with the Protestants late in the war. You have different players who are turning in and turning around, like the Swedes entered the war when the Protestants were losing the war, and then they turn it around for the Protestants, and it's kind of like masked in this, like, oh yeah, the Catholics and the Protestants hate each other. And I kind of think the same way about these Middle Eastern wars. It's masked in this sectarian divide, which definitely has a huge element to it. But ultimately, it's the major theme is like who gets the religious nepotism leads to a cycle of revenge killing and a cycle of violence, because when one side bands together and participates in some type of sectarian nepotism with government jobs
in the name of God.
In the name of God, it forces the other side to band together as well.
Right.
But it's been another major theme that I found close to the 30-Year War, and I've been trying to do some more research on it because it's an interesting topic that never really gets touched. Is that the 30-Year War was also largely mercenary armies, because at that time these states didn't really have these large standing armies like they did, with Napoleon, the rise of Napoleon. They counted on mercenary armies. And there's a lot of similar elements in the Middle Eastern wars as well, because a lot of these powers like Saudi Arabia, Iran, even Syria, and a lot of these countries count on their proxy forces or their allies or militia forces. So they're just like two interesting connections between these, like the length of the war, as well as the sectarian nature, as well as the tactics, or at least the people who are fighting the war, are largely either mercenaries or foreigners, or really a lot of them are foreigners, not all of them. But it's just interesting. It's interesting connections, and I don't know. I think it's an interesting topic to explore, like the connections between
you know what they say,
the long Middle East war and the 30-Year War.
You know what they say: history doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes.
It's a good one. I think we can. I think it's a good place to end, right? Is there anything else that we need to talk about or plug?
No.
Yeah, follow us on Twitter, Henry Zamoda. The links are there below. Rate and review the podcast, which is always nice. We're like at 209 or something like that, which is great. I appreciate all the reviews and the ratings. It seems like just yesterday we were begging you to get us to 10 reviews or 10 ratings, and now we're over 200. Subscribe to the podcast, share it with your friend, rate and review it, and keep on listening to it. This project's been going on over a year now, and we're gaining a lot of traction, and we can't gain more traction without people continuing to listen and share with your friends. We're so bad at plugging and telling people to subscribe. We need to do it once in a while.
Yeah.
We're just like so abruptly like, all right, peace.
See ya. Bye.
No share. Yeah. Share our social media stuff and follow us.
Yeah, if you like it, tell a friend. That's like the best way that this podcast has grown. When we started and we only had like the 15 people who gave a shit about what we were talking about, and they shared it with a couple of their friends, and it just ballooned from there. So yeah, if you like the show, tell a friend.
All right. Peace.